My reflection. So for me, RP wasn't really difficult. It was more tedious because of how important the aspects of each chapter were to the final product. And when you're doing each individual chapter, you don't realize the importance of how it'll affect your final product until you're at the end of RP. And you're like, wow, I did terrible in this chapter. So then you have to basically rewrite the whole thing over again because of your negligence towards putting more effort into the chapters. And this happened to me in chapter 1 and 2. But for chapter 1, no, for chapter 2 wasn't necessarily bad. It was more so it didn't have the context that it needed for my final product. And this was because my chapter 1 was when I was debating on how I was supposed to be doing this experiment, and at the end it didn't really relate back to my final product since my chapter 1 was based on rats and how it would affect their brain instead of how it would affect ants, which were my final subject. So I definitely had to revise chapter 1, and my chapter 2 was based off my chapter 1, so I had to revise that too. And it was definitely really frustrating, especially the chapter 2, because chapter 1 wasn't as bad since it was kind of just the basics like purpose of the study, state the problem, etc. But chapter 2 was the review of literature, which is basically the longest part of RP. It's basically a research paper. So I had to redo a whole lot on that chapter because I mainly talked about how it would affect the brain. Ants don't really, they have brains, but they're not brains, you know? So it was definitely frustrating, and it taught me to plan ahead because chapter 2 would not have ended like that if I had got my stuff together by the end of chapter 1. And it also taught me to put 100% effort into the things I do regularly because it might come back to haunt you like it did for me. Because I didn't do my chapter 1 or 2 correct, so I had to come back and finish it for the final product, for the final paper. Something else that I definitely had problems with was working with living animals. I would not recommend working with living animals alone without supervision because you watch videos and assume that you know what to do, but it's an entirely different thing actually working with the animals because the ants, I watched tons of videos on how I was supposed to take care of them, etc. But when they actually came, I did terrible because my first bunch of ants, they died mainly because of the habitat I put them in. Looking back at it, looking back at the things I did at the beginning of the year, I'm like, wow, that was really dumb. And I guess that's a show of my character growth because if you look back at things and think that wow, you did your thing, it's like that means you're not growing and you're stuck at the same place that you are now. But well, yeah. What else? I definitely learned a lot from RP educational wise, especially when it came to statistics, which I learned I'm terrible at. But I think that was the most difficult part of RP between chapter 2. It was learning how to do the statistics for certain things. It wasn't necessarily difficult to learn, but the abundant information that I was forced to retain in that time frame was like, what are we talking about? So especially when it came to the certain thing that you're supposed to do for your experiment, because different experiments have different methods of collecting data. Mine was linear regression, non-linear regression, and I learned that you have to do the R-squared thing, and then there's the XL minor thing where it gives you the R-squared. It gives you a lot, and it's really a lot to retain. And I think that was definitely the most hard part of RP because I don't really have any foundations in statistics, so naturally I'm not really gonna know what's going on as a whole. But I learned a lot because I didn't really specify in it. But like I said before, working with live animals is very different from what it looks like when you're just watching it. And because I tried to look for shortcuts for my experimentation, it led to me being behind my classmates because my first group of ants died because I tried to put them in a habitat that they were not suited for, and I tried to separate them because I got one tube of ants. I tried to separate them into 4 groups, like isolated from each other, which was a terrible idea because ants are really social creatures. So if they separate from each other, then they're gonna go crazy. So that's how they died, how the first bunch died. And it definitely taught me to do better when it comes to things like that, and to make sure that I do proper research, or at least more intensive research, before I work with live animals. Also, don't take shortcuts. Just do it. Just do it, because it'll lead to a lot of problems that you really don't want to deal with, and it's just not worth it. It also took me a really long time to actually like find the best way to do the experiment, because I didn't want them to just rely on their sense of smell to go through the maze, but I also needed them to go through the maze. So I had to perfect the procedures, which took a really long time. And if anything that RPS taught me is patience, and I'm really glad it did, because rather fail now than later. Thank you for coming to my reflection.